The cartwheels never stop screaming. That's the first thing you learn about this job. Not the smile, not the safety demonstrations, not the careful way you fold a napkin into a swan at the gate. You learn that the metal cartwheels on a Boeing 777 produce a high-pitched whine that burrows into the back of your skull after the 4th hour of a flight, and that you will hear it in your sleep for years. I'd been hearing it for 3 years of Seoul to New York. 3 years of recycled air that smells faintly of someone else's perfume and the ghost of heated meals nobody finishes. 3 years of layovers in hotel rooms with blackout curtains that never quite reach the windowsill, of calling home to hear my mother's voice asking when I'm coming back for good, of sleeping in segments, 3 hours here, 4 hours there, until sleep became something I borrowed rather than owned. I pulled the cart past row 12 with the practiced efficiency of someone who had learned to be invisible. That was the other thing about this job. You became furniture. Necessary, functional, entirely forgettable. Business class passengers looked through me like I was made of air. First class was worse. The ones who looked at you at all did so with the particular blankness of people who had been waited on so long they'd forgotten the faces of those who served them. I preferred it that way. Invisible was easier. Sparkling or still? I asked the woman in 14A, and she didn't look up from her phone. She extended 2 fingers, still, without a single shift in her gaze. Her nails were the color of dried roses. Her hair fell in a dark curtain that probably cost more to maintain than my monthly rent. I poured the water and moved on. The flight from Incheon had been boarding for 40 minutes when I noticed the shift in the cabin air. Not a smell exactly, more like a pressure change. A subtle rearrangement of the atmosphere, the way a room reorganizes itself around a storm before the storm arrives. I was resetting a tray near the galley curtain when I heard it, the particular hush that moves through a space when someone commands it without trying to. I turned. He was walking through the business class cabin toward the first class section, and he moved the way water moves through a narrow channel, with the quiet certainty of something that has never had a reason to rush. He was younger than I expected from the way people deferred to him. Late 20s, perhaps 30, with the kind of face that seemed almost unreasonably constructed. Sharp jaw, mouth set in a permanent expression of controlled thought. Dark eyes that moved across the cabin in a single sweep that took in every detail before settling on nothing. He wore charcoal, a suit that hadn't come off a rack. Behind him, half a step back on his left, walked a broader man in dark clothing who was not looking at the passengers. He was looking at the spaces between them. I pressed myself back against the galley partition without fully realizing I'd moved. They passed close enough that I caught it. Cedar, and something cooler beneath it, clean and expensive, the kind of scent that didn't announce itself, but stayed after. The man with the sharp jaw didn't glance toward the galley. His eyes were already forward, already past me, already in the first-class cabin where his seat waited. I let out a breath I hadn't known I was holding. Evelyn. My colleague Dana appeared at my elbow, her voice low and carrying the particular edge of someone who has already gathered more information than you have. First class, seats 2A and 4A. I looked at her. 4A, she said carefully, is a woman. Early 30s, boarded separately, no connecting ticket. She checked in under a different reservation. She paused just long enough. 2A is him. I understood what she wasn't saying. This was not an uncommon story at 35,000 feet. A man who could afford 2 first-class tickets and a particular kind of silence around the transaction. I had served variations of this arrangement before. It never required my opinion. I'll take the first-class service, I said, because Dana had a husband in Busan who worried about her, and because I had no one worrying about me, and that made certain things easier. I straightened my jacket, smoothed the front of my uniform with both palms, and pushed through the curtain. The first-class cabin held 8 seats on this aircraft. The woman in 4A had already arranged herself with the ease of someone fluent in luxury. Shoes removed, a silk sleep mask pushed up onto her forehead like a crown. A glass of something golden balanced in her hand, though we hadn't yet begun the beverage service. She had ordered it before boarding, Dana had told me. She knew how to do that. She was beautiful in the way that required maintenance, the kind of beauty that was also a project and a discipline. Her dress was ivory. Her jewelry was minimal and devastating. She didn't look at me when I approached. I moved to 2A. He was reading, not a phone, a physical document, papers held in one hand, the other resting open on the armrest. His jacket had been removed and folded with inhuman precision across the edge of the seat. In shirt sleeves, he looked younger and more dangerous at once. "Good evening," I said. "May I bring you something before we depart?" He looked up. It was the first time his eyes landed directly on me, and there was a quality to it I couldn't immediately name. Not attraction. Nothing so simple. More like recognition. The way a person looks at something they weren't expecting to find interesting and finds themselves recalibrating. "Water," he said. His English was unaccented and careful. "No ice." "Of course." I turned back toward the galley, and in that exact moment, as the aircraft gave a gentle lurch against the jet bridge, my heel caught the slight rise of the cabin floor at the curtain threshold, a ridge I had navigated 1,000 times. And I went forward. The tray in my hand tilted. The glass I'd been carrying from a previous service, already poured, already forgotten in my hand. A rookie mistake I would replay in my head for weeks. Described a clean arc and its contents landed across the front of his shirt. Cold. Complete. Precise in the way that only accidents can be. The entire first-class cabin went very still. I straightened immediately, my face burning with a heat that had nothing to do with the cabin temperature, my hands already reaching for the napkins at my belt. "I'm so sorry," I said, and my voice was steady only because 3 years had taught my voice to be steady in moments when nothing else was. "I'm so sorry, please let me—" He had gone very still. Not with anger. That was the thing that confused me. His face had not changed at all. He looked down at his shirt, then up at me, and there was something in his expression that was almost the beginning of something else entirely. His guard had taken a single step forward from the rear galley position. The woman in 4A had turned in her seat. Her expression was unreadable, but her eyes moved between the man and me with the particular attention of someone performing a rapid and private calculation. I pressed a folded cloth against the front of his shirt, which was when I realized my hands were touching his chest, which was when I realized how close I was standing, which was when every single professional instinct I possessed arrived approximately 4 seconds too late. He glanced down at my hands, then back at my face. "Leave it," he said quietly. 2 words. Flat even, carrying no particular emotion. But the guard stepped back. I removed my hands, folded them in front of me, met his eyes for 1 second, 1 single second, before dropping my gaze to exactly the correct point on the middle distance that flight attendants learn to occupy when they are apologizing. "I will have a replacement shirt delivered from our onboard amenity kit," I said. "And I'll arrange for the dry cleaning cost to be covered by—" "That won't be necessary." I nodded once, professionally, and turned toward the galley. I did not look at 4A as I passed. Behind the curtain, I braced both hands against the cold metal of the cart and stared at the brushed steel of the galley wall. My heart was performing something irregular and undignified against my ribs. In 12 years of hospitality work, 3 on the ground, 3 in the air, I had spilled on passengers twice. Both times had been immediately forgettable. This did not feel immediately forgettable. Dana appeared beside me. She said nothing for a moment, just looked at the expression on my face. "How bad?" she finally asked. I thought about those eyes, the stillness, the 2 words, the way the woman in 4A had watched me the entire time I was walking away. "I don't know yet," I said honestly. The aircraft began to move. The flight to New York was 14 hours. I spent the first 4 of them performing the careful choreography of invisibility, meal service, beverage rounds, the quiet collection of empty glasses and forgotten wrappers, while maintaining the precise spatial awareness required to never again position myself within spilling distance of seat 2A. He had changed into the amenity kit shirt. White, thin cotton, the kind of thing designed as an afterthought for passengers who hadn't planned to need it. On him, it looked deliberate. Everything about him looked deliberate. I noticed this from a distance. Professionally. The woman in 4A ate almost nothing. She picked at a small plate of fruit, drank 2 glasses of champagne with the measured pace of someone who knew exactly how much she could consume before it showed, and spent the remainder of the meal service with her attention divided between her phone and the man across the aisle. She never spoke to him directly during the meal, but twice I saw her hand cross the aisle, a touch at his wrist, brief and proprietary, and he didn't pull away. I refilled her glass without comment. Around hour 5, when the cabin lights dimmed and most passengers retreated behind sleep masks and blankets, I was restocking the forward galley when I became aware of a presence behind the curtain that was too still to be Dana. I turned. He was standing at the galley entrance. Not inside, the threshold only, one shoulder leaning against the frame, with a casualness that managed to feel entirely unconvincing, given the quality of attention he was directing at me. He held his empty water glass loosely in one hand. His guard was visible as a shadow at the far end of the first-class cabin, watching the curtain. "The water," he said. I took the glass, filled it from the chilled carafe, handed it back without a word, which was the correct professional response, and also the only response I was capable of in that precise moment. He didn't move. "You've been avoiding this section of the cabin," he observed. It wasn't an accusation. It was the kind of statement that arrives already knowing it's correct, and is simply offering you the opportunity to confirm. "I've been managing a full service for 8 passengers," I said. "I apologize if the timing seemed... I'm not complaining." He turned the glass once in his hand. "I'm observing." The recycled air between us felt suddenly very specific. I could hear the low hum of the engines, the distant shift of someone adjusting their seat 3 rows back, the almost inaudible sound of Dana's cart in business class. "Is there anything else I can bring you?" I asked. He looked at me for a moment longer than the question required. Then, "No." He returned to his seat. I stood in the galley for a count of 10, staring at the carafe, before I trusted my hands enough to set it down without sound. We landed at JFK in early morning, when the sky above Queens was the gray pink of something that hadn't yet decided what it wanted to be. The deplaning process moved in the usual order. First class first, the ordered dispersal of expensive luggage and expensive people toward the customs hall. I stood at the forward door in my correct position, delivering the standard farewell phrase to each departing passenger with my standard expression, which had survived worse than 1 spilled glass and 1 brief galley conversation. The woman from 4A passed first. She glanced at me once, a look that lasted less than 2 seconds, but contained something I couldn't classify. Something that wasn't quite hostility, and wasn't quite curiosity, but lived in the narrow space between them. And then she was through the door and gone. He was the last to leave his section. He stopped at the door. His guard continued 3 paces forward and waited, visibly, in the jet bridge. "Your name," he said. My name tag was on my jacket. He had seen it. This was not a request for information he didn't have. "Evelyn," I said. He repeated it once, under his breath, the way a person tests the weight of something before deciding whether to carry it. Then he reached into the interior pocket of his jacket, perfectly restored now, perfectly pressed in the way that suggested either a change of clothes retrieved from luggage or a willingness to wear rumpled charcoal without apparent concern, and produced a card. He held it out. It was cream-colored, heavy stock, with nothing on it except a phone number. No name, no title, no company. "For the shirt," he said. I looked at the card, then at him. "That really isn't necessary. The airline..." "I know it isn't necessary." Something shifted almost imperceptibly at the corner of his mouth. "Take it anyway." I took it. He walked through the door without looking back, and I stood at the threshold of a Boeing 777 at gate B14 with a cream-colored card in my hand, and the particular sensation of a story that hadn't finished yet pressing against the inside of my chest. The New York layover was 31 hours. The airline put us in a midtown hotel that had once been something grand and was now merely adequate. High ceilings that remembered their own elegance, carpets that had absorbed the footsteps of 1,000 transient lives. I shared a floor with Dana and 2 other crew members, and we had the unspoken agreement of people who spent too much time together in small metal tubes. Proximity did not require constant company. I slept for 6 hours. Dreamless, the way sleep is when your body has simply switched off rather than rested. I woke to rain against the window and the card on the nightstand. I picked it up, turned it over, set it down again. I showered, made coffee from the in-room machine, which produced something that tasted like a rumor of coffee. Sat at the small desk by the window, and watched the rain remake the street below into a dark mirror. I had not imagined the quality of that attention. 3 years in this job had given me an accurate instrument for reading the way people looked at you. The dismissive scan, the transactional glance, the occasional uncomfortable interest that required management. What happened on that aircraft had not fit any of those categories neatly, and the misfit was lodged in me like a splinter I couldn't find. I thought about Foray, ivory dress, rose-colored nails, the proprietary touch at his wrist. I thought about the card, a phone number and nothing else, which was either minimalist or deliberate, and I suspected it was both. I was not the kind of woman who called numbers on cards given to her by men traveling with other women. I had a clear, working sense of my own dignity, which had been constructed across years of small humiliations endured quietly, and had therefore cost me something real. I was not going to spend it on a gesture that would not lead anywhere worth arriving. I turned the card face down on the desk. On the second day of the layover, Dana and I walked 20 blocks through the rain to a Korean restaurant she'd found online, where we ate pork belly and talked about everything except the things we were actually thinking about. She mentioned the man from 2A obliquely. Quite a face for a man flying with his side arrangement, she said, which was Dana's way of checking in without asking directly, and I agreed with something non-committal and changed the subject. That night I dreamed of cedar and cold water, and a stillness that had weight. I woke at 3 a.m., with my heart doing the same undignified thing it had done in the galley, and I lay in the dark of the adequate hotel room and looked at the ceiling and thought about nothing at all for a very long time. In the morning, before I could construct a sufficient argument against it, I picked up my phone. I typed the number. I wrote, "This is Evelyn. Flight 112, Seat 2A. I wanted to apologize again properly. I stared at the message for 40 seconds. I sent it. The reply came in under 2 minutes. Dinner. Tonight. I'll send an address. Not a question. Not an invitation exactly. Something that existed in the narrow territory between the two. The kind of statement that already understood how the conversation was going to end, and was simply observing the formality of its beginning. My thumb hovered over the screen. Outside, the rain had stopped. The street below reflected a sky that had finally decided to clear, cold and pale and open in every direction. I typed, "All right," pressed send, and sat very still in the quiet of the room, with the feeling that I had just stepped off something I hadn't realized I was standing on. The address he sent was in Tribeca. I looked it up, which was either due diligence or an attempt to talk myself out of going, and found very little. A restaurant with no website, no social media presence, no listing on any of the platforms people use to decide whether somewhere is worth their evening. The only reference I located was a single line in a 7-year-old article about New York's private dining scene. Discreet, reservation only, the kind of establishment that doesn't need to advertise because its clientele doesn't need to search. I stood in front of my open suitcase for longer than the decision warranted. I owned 2 dresses appropriate for the kind of place that didn't need to advertise. I chose the darker one. Deep navy, simple cut, the sort of thing that could belong in almost any room without making a statement. I had learned across 3 years of observing the women in first class that the most effective way to enter a room you didn't quite belong in was to move as though the question had never occurred to you. The car arrived at 7:30. Not a taxi. A black sedan with a driver who had clearly been told my name and hotel in advance, who confirmed both without being asked, and who drove with the particular focused silence of someone paid well enough to have no opinions about the nature of his employer's arrangements. I sat in the back and watched Midtown give way to the wider streets of Lower Manhattan, and thought about what Dana would say if she knew where I was going. She would say, "Evelyn, that man is carrying something you can't see yet, and the invisible weight is always the heaviest kind." She would be right. She was almost always right about people. I went anyway. The restaurant was a townhouse on a narrow street, the kind of building that had been something else before it was this. A residence, perhaps, or a merchant's office 2 centuries ago. There was no sign. The door was dark wood, and it opened before I reached it. Inside, warm light, the smell of something slow-cooked and complex. The hush of a space where sound had been deliberately absorbed by stone walls and heavy linen and the considered distance between tables. There were perhaps 10 tables in the main room. 3 were occupied, and the diners at each of them shared the quality of people who had chosen this place specifically because it would not require them to be seen. He was already there. Of course he was already there. I understood instinctively that he was always already there, that he arrived at places before other people because the alternative, entering after, meant passing through a room without having first assessed it. He stood when I approached the table, which surprised me. The gesture was old-fashioned and entirely natural, as though it had never occurred to him not to. His guard was not visible, but I noticed a man near the entrance whose posture was incorrect for a casual diner. I noticed a second near the interior bar whose attention moved in the wrong direction, outward rather than in. I had grown up watching my uncle, a police officer, work a room, and I recognized the particular vigilance that is dressed in civilian clothes. "You came," Shungho said. I said I would. Something moved at the edge of his expression. People say many things. We sat. A server appeared with water and a menu I didn't ask for, and I had the clear sense that the evening had been arranged in advance, not in an oppressive way, but in the way of someone accustomed to removing uncertainty from his environment before inviting others into it. "I looked up this restaurant," I said. "I couldn't find much." "That's intentional. Most things with you seem intentional." He looked at me across the table with that quality of attention I had been trying to name since the aircraft, and I realized what it was. He listened with his entire face. Not the performed attentiveness of someone waiting for their turn to speak, but the genuine orientation of a person who has learned that information lives in the spaces between words, as much as in the words themselves. "You're observant," he said. "It's occupational." "No." He shook his head slightly. "Plenty of people in your profession aren't. You're naturally observant. There's a difference." I looked down at the menu. The prices were not listed, which was either pretension or the particular confidence of a place that understood its clientele would not require them. "The woman on the flight," I said, because I was not the kind of person who circled the thing I actually meant to say. I need to understand the situation I've walked into before I decide how much of the evening to stay for. The directness landed. I watched it land. Something in his face adjusted. Not displeasure, almost the opposite. "She's someone I've known for 3 years," he said. "It's a complicated arrangement. It's ending." "That's what people say." "Yes," he agreed. "It is." He held my gaze. "I'm telling you anyway." The server returned. Sungho ordered without looking at the menu, in Korean, and the server nodded with the fluency of someone who had taken this order before. When he asked what I'd like, I pointed to something that sounded like it contained vegetables and might constitute a reasonable decision. The food arrived in courses, unhurried, each one better than the last. We talked. Not about the obvious things, not about his work, not about the details he clearly had no intention of offering, not about the woman in 4A whose name I still didn't know. We talked about Seoul, which we had both left and both carried. We talked about the particular exhaustion of living in motion, of belonging to airports and hotel rooms, more than to any fixed address. He asked questions that were more precise than small talk. Where I was from originally, what I had studied before the airline, whether I had family that required managing from a distance. That last question he phrased carefully, and I understood it was not casual. My mother, I said. In Inchin. She's well. She asks when I'm coming home. Do you know the answer? Not yet. He nodded as though this confirmed something. By the third course, I had stopped monitoring the exits and started simply being in the room, which was either comfort or foolishness, and I was aware it might be both. Then his phone, one of two I'd noticed on the table, placed face down in a way that suggested availability rather than distraction, lit up silently. He glanced at it. Something in his posture shifted, almost nothing, the way a temperature changes before weather arrives. He excused himself. 3 minutes at most. The man near the entrance straightened when Seung-ho moved past him, and I watched the brief exchange. Nothing spoken, only a look from Seung-ho, and a micro-nod in return. And understood that whatever had come through on that phone had been expected and was not benign. He returned. Sat. Looked at me with an expression that had closed itself slightly. I have to leave earlier than I planned, he said. I'm sorry. It's all right. It isn't. He said it quietly and meant it. I'd like to see you again, in Seoul when you're back. I looked at him, at the careful arrangement of his face over whatever the phone had told him, at the two men positioned near the exits of a restaurant that didn't advertise, where nobody's prices were listed, and nobody's names were on anything. You should know, I said slowly, that I'm not someone who can be managed. Something in him went very still. I'm not trying to manage you, he said. You arrange the car, the table, the order. That's hospitality, not management. The distinction in his voice was precise and serious. There's a difference. I held his gaze for a long moment. Seoul, I said finally. I'm back in 2 weeks. The stillness in him released, almost imperceptibly. He reached across the table and his hand covered mine for a single moment. Not long, not dramatic. And then withdrew before I could decide how to react. The car took me back to the hotel. I sat in the back and watched the city pass and pressed my palm flat against my knee, where I could still feel the ghost of that brief warmth. In my room, I sat at the desk and did not turn the lamp on. Sat in the dark with the rain-cleared sky outside and the particular knowledge that I had stepped further than I'd planned, and that the ground behind me felt less solid than it had this morning. My phone lit up. A message. Get home safely. I'll be in touch. Followed, 30 seconds later, by a second message. I don't say things I don't mean. I read both messages twice. Then I set the phone down and looked at the ceiling and thought about cedar and cold water and a stillness that knew exactly how much it weighed. Seoul in November smells like roasted chestnuts and cold concrete and the particular sharpness of a city that never fully sleeps. I had forgotten that somehow, across 3 years of leaving and returning. Every time the airport doors opened and the air hit my face, I remembered it all at once. Childhood winters, the market near my mother's apartment, the way the Han River looks when the temperature drops and the light goes flat and silver over the water. Home was not always a comfort. Sometimes it was just a place that knew your name before you'd decided who you were. I cleared customs at noon. My mother had left 3 voice messages, which I listened to on the train into the city, her voice carrying the particular combination of warmth and low-grade complaint that was her native dialect of love. I would visit on Thursday. I told her Wednesday so she'd have a day to prepare and feel adequate about it. My apartment was a small place in Mapo. 1 bedroom, a kitchen that fit 2 people only if they cooperated, a window that looked out over a narrow street where a tofu vendor set up at 6 every morning and packed up at 2. I had chosen it because it was quiet, and because the rent did not require me to calculate every purchase, and because after years of spaces I didn't own, having one that held my books and my particular arrangement of small objects felt necessary in a way I hadn't expected. I unpacked, slept 8 hours, woke to a city making its ordinary sounds, and lay still for a few minutes, recalibrating. His first message came at 9 in the morning, 4 days after I'd landed. "Are you settled back?" I looked at it for a moment before answering. "Yes, since Tuesday. I should have messaged sooner." A pause of perhaps a minute. I was handling something. I had learned in those 4 days to read his messages the way you read weather, not for what they said explicitly, but for what the phrasing compressed. Handling something was a door left deliberately ajar. I didn't push it open. "It's fine," I wrote. "I've been visiting my mother." "How is she?" The question surprised me every time. He asked about my mother with a consistency that felt less like courtesy and more like genuine interest, which was either disarming or a very sophisticated form of it. Healthy, opinionated, exactly herself. His response: a single line that arrived with what felt like a smile behind it, though I had no evidence for that. "The best kind of person." We met for the first time in Seoul on a Thursday evening, 2 weeks after New York. He sent a car again, the same quality of vehicle, the same quality of silence from the driver. The location this time was not a restaurant, but a private residence. A house in Seongbuk-dong, tucked behind a gate, and a wall of pine trees that absorbed the sounds of the street so completely that stepping through the entrance felt like crossing into a different acoustic world. The house itself was understated outside and considered within. High ceilings, wooden floors that had aged to a deep warmth, art on the walls that had been chosen rather than collected. It smelled of pine and paper, and something cooking from a kitchen I couldn't see. Seung-ho met me at the door himself. No jacket tonight, just a dark sweater, which somehow made him look more, not less, formidable. The way a familiar thing is sometimes stranger than a formal one. He looked at me when I walked in with that same quality of attention, and beneath it something that was less contained than it had been on the aircraft. As though the controlled stillness had been adjusted slightly, a dial turned a single degree toward open. "You look tired," he said, which was not what people usually said. "I'm always tired," I replied honestly. "It's structural at this point." The corner of his mouth moved. "Come in." We ate in a room off the kitchen, not formal, not the arranged elegance of Tribeca, but something closer to actual domesticity. He had cooked, which surprised me enough that I said so. "Why?" he asked. "I didn't expect it." "I had to learn," he said simply, and didn't elaborate, and I understood there was a story behind those 4 words that belonged to a part of his life he would offer in pieces, if at all. We talked for 3 hours. I learned things in the way you learn things from someone who is careful, not through declaration, but through accumulation. The slow building of a picture from details that seem incidental until they aren't. He had grown up in Busan. He had an older sister he spoke of with a precision that suggested both deep loyalty and long distance. He had been doing what he did since he was 19, which he stated flatly and without apology, and I received it the same way because I had known it since the aircraft, and pretending otherwise would have been a dishonesty neither of us deserved. What I hadn't known, what arrived that evening as something that required sitting with, was the controlled intensity with which he watched me cross the room. The way, when I reached for something on the table, his attention tracked the movement with a focus that was not casual. The way, when I mentioned a flight route that took me through Hong Kong 3 times a month, something tightened almost invisibly in his face. "I don't love that route," he said. "It's one of my regulars." "I know." He said it quietly. "I looked at your schedule." I set down my glass. "You looked at my schedule." "Yes." The directness of it. No apology, no deflection, simply the acknowledgement of a fact, left me without an immediate response. "That's not something you had permission to do," I said carefully. "No," he agreed. It isn't. He held my gaze. I did it anyway. The silence between us had weight. I was aware of it pressing against the edges of the room, against the warm walls and the smell of pine, and the dinner we had just shared. Seung-ho. I said his name precisely, which was the closest I had to a boundary marker. I told you in New York that I won't be managed. I remember. This is what that looks like, what you just described. Yes. He leaned forward slightly, elbows on the table, and his eyes didn't leave mine. And I'm telling you because I won't pretend I didn't do it. I checked your schedule because I needed to know you were safe on routes I know are monitored by people I have difficulties with. That's the truth of why. A pause. It doesn't make it acceptable, but it's the reason. I looked at him for a long time. What kind of difficulties? I said slowly. Involve monitoring flight routes. He was quiet for a moment. Then, the kind I'm working to resolve. It was not an answer. It was the shape of where an answer would go, once he trusted enough to place it there. I should have been alarmed. I was alarmed, in the way that lives below the surface of a decision rather than above it. But I was also, underneath the alarm, looking at a man who had just told me an uncomfortable truth rather than a comfortable lie. And I had spent enough years receiving comfortable lies from people who thought I wouldn't notice the difference. I picked up my glass again. When it's resolved, I said, I'd like a real explanation. Something in his face shifted in a way I hadn't seen before. Not relief exactly. More like the specific quality of attention released that had been held so long, the person had stopped feeling it. When it's resolved, he said, you'll have one. The evening ended late. He walked me to the car himself, which again the guard observed from a respectful distance, and at the gate, in the cold November air with the pine trees absorbing the sounds of the street, he turned to me and looked at my face for a moment with an expression I couldn't entirely read. I need you to be careful, he said. On your routes. On all of them. You're worrying me. Good. His hand came up and adjusted the collar of my coat. A single, brief gesture, almost nothing, but deliberate in the way all his gestures were deliberate. Worry is appropriate. I'd rather you were worried and safe than comfortable and not. The car pulled away, and I turned to watch the gate close behind me. And I sat in the back of the dark sedan feeling the warmth of a hand that had touched the collar of my coat for approximately 4 seconds. And underneath the warmth was something else. The low, persistent frequency of a world I was standing at the edge of, hearing its sounds through the wall. 6 days later, I was in the crew lounge at Incheon Airport when a woman sat down across from me. Ivory dress, rose-colored nails. The woman from 4A looked at me with the calculation I remembered from the aircraft, and this time she let me see it fully. I think, she said pleasantly in perfect English, that you and I should talk. Her name was Jisoo. She told me this herself, unprompted, as though names were currency she was choosing to spend. She sat across from me in the crew lounge with the particular composure of someone who had rehearsed this moment and was now executing it without visible effort. And I sat very still and let her speak, because I had learned, from watching him, that stillness was often the most powerful response available. I've known Seung-ho for 4 years, she said. I understand what he is. I also understand what he does when he finds something he wants. What does he do? I asked. He arranges things. She tilted her head slightly. The car, the restaurant, the schedule he looked at without telling you. She watched my face. He told you about that, didn't he? He would. He has a particular relationship with honesty. Selective but precise. He tells you the uncomfortable truths and withholds the structural ones. The lounge hummed around us. An announcement moved through the terminal in 3 languages. Somewhere behind me, a crew member laughed at something on their phone. What structural truths? I asked. Jisoo looked at me for a moment with something that wasn't quite pity and wasn't quite warning, but occupied the territory between them. The man who was supposed to be my future, she said carefully, Made a decision 3 years ago that put Seong-ho's younger sister in danger. A business arrangement that became a betrayal. His sister survived. The man did not remain in a position to cause further harm. She let that settle. I was connected to that man. Not by loyalty. I didn't know the full extent of what he'd done. But by proximity. Seong-ho kept me close afterward, because proximity to him is the safest place to be when you're tangled in that world and have no other protection. She paused. It was never what it looked like on the aircraft. I want you to understand that clearly. I process this slowly, the way you process something that rearranges the furniture of everything you thought you understood. Why are you telling me this? I asked. Because he won't. Not yet. He'll protect you by keeping you at the edge of information, and he'll think that's kindness. And it is, in his way. She smoothed the front of her dress with one palm. That gesture I remembered from the aircraft, unconscious and elegant. But you're not the kind of woman who does well at edges. I watched you for 14 hours on that flight. You're someone who needs to know what room she's standing in. She stood, picked up her bag. The difficulty he mentioned, she said. With the routes. There's a man named Park who operates out of Hong Kong. He moves things through cargo on commercial flights, and he's been watching the Incheon-Hong Kong route specifically. Seong-ho has been working to close that operation for 8 months. It ends within the next few weeks. She looked at me directly. Request a route change, just for a month. Tell your supervisor it's personal reasons. Then she left. I sat in the crew lounge for a long time after, with the announcement system cycling through its languages overhead and the particular sensation of a picture snapping into focus. Every detail suddenly intelligible, every careful omission suddenly visible in the shape of what had been left out. I picked up my phone and requested the route change. Then I called Seong-ho. He answered on the second ring. Jisoo came to see me, I said. A silence. Not long, 2, perhaps 3 seconds, but full. I know, he said quietly. She told me she was going to. You let her. I couldn't give you what she could. She has a perspective I don't. Another pause. Are you all right? The question landed with such genuine weight that I had to sit with it for a moment before answering. I changed my route, I said. I heard something shift in his breath. Relief, unmistakable and unguarded. The first fully unguarded thing I'd ever heard from him. Thank you, he said. Don't thank me. Explain things to me properly when this is over. I will. And then quieter. I promise. The weeks that followed had a particular texture. The strange normalcy of continuing to live your life while knowing that somewhere beneath its surface, things were being resolved that you weren't permitted to see. I flew different routes. Amsterdam, Singapore, Sydney. I called my mother on Thursdays. I restocked my small apartment with winter things, a heavier blanket, the specific tea I only allowed myself in cold months, new books stacked beside the window that looked over the tofu vendor's street. Seong-ho messaged every day. Not heavily, not with the suffocating frequency of someone who needed constant confirmation. More like a steady signal, regular and reliable. How was the Singapore layover? Your mother. How is she? Sleep when you can. Once, at 2 a.m, soul time, simply, still awake? And when I responded yes, he called, and we talked for 40 minutes about nothing consequential and everything that mattered. His voice low and unhurried in the dark. And I sat cross-legged on my bed with the city quiet outside my window, and thought that this specific thing was the most dangerous development yet. Not the world he came from. Not the careful men near restaurant exits or the phone numbers on cream-colored cards or the route I'd changed without fully understanding why. This, the 40 minutes, the voice in the dark. I was in Amsterdam. Gray February light, a canal outside the hotel window wearing a thin skin of ice. When he called at an unusual hour, and his voice carried something different. It's done, he said. I sat up in bed, Park. Everything connected to him. It's finished. A breath. You can take back your regular routes. You're safe. The word landed strangely. Safe. As though safety were a destination rather than a condition, something you arrived at and unpacked your bags in. Are you all right? I asked, which was the same question he always asked me, and I heard him register the reversal of it. Yes, he said, and then, after a moment, come home soon. He gave me the explanation he'd promised on a Sunday in March. We sat in the Shongbuk house with the pine trees outside holding their earliest green, and the windows open to let in air that had finally decided to be warm. He spoke for a long time, and I listened in the way he had taught me, without interruption, taking in not just the words but the weight behind them. His sister. 17 when it happened. The betrayal that had nearly cost her everything. The 8 years since in which he had built something formidable out of grief and loyalty, and the particular determination of a person who has decided that the people he loves will not be made vulnerable again. I thought, listening, about golden cages, and whether the bars were still bars if the person who built them was trying to keep the danger out, rather than the inhabitant in. I didn't have a clean answer. I need to know something, I said when he finished. He waited. Is this, what we are, something you chose? Or something you arranged because it fit a need I don't fully understand? The question cost me something real to ask. I watched him take it seriously, the way he took everything seriously, his eyes on mine without deflection. The night on the aircraft, he said slowly, you spilled water on my shirt, and then stood in front of me with your hands shaking and your voice completely level, and you apologized with more dignity than most people manage in their best moments. Something moved in his expression, tender and unguarded in the way I had only heard before in a voice at 2 a.m. I didn't arrange that. I didn't arrange any of what came after. I'm not capable of arranging the way I look for your messages in the morning. He paused. The car, the table, the schedule, those things I can control, and I control them because the alternative is fear, and I refuse to be afraid for you when I can do something instead. He looked at me steadily. But you, Evelyn, you I didn't plan. The pine trees moved outside in the warm March wind. I thought about 3 years of recycled air and cartwheels screaming and the careful construction of invisibility. I thought about a card with nothing on it but a number. About a woman in an ivory dress who had told me the truth because she understood that I needed the room I was standing in named correctly. I thought about 40 minutes in the dark and come home soon. I'm not invisible to you, I said. It wasn't a question. No, he said. You never were. I looked at him across the table. This man who was dangerous and careful and capable of extraordinary stillness and occasional devastating honesty. And I understood something about myself that had been assembling quietly across months without my full awareness. I was not the same person who had pressed herself against a galley partition to let a stranger pass. That woman had been fluent in disappearing. I had been unlearning it, gradually and without ceremony, in the presence of someone who kept finding me in the room regardless of where I stood in it. I'm staying, I said. Not because I don't understand what that means, because I do. Something in his face, some last remaining held thing, released completely. He reached across the table and covered my hand with his, and this time neither of us withdrew. Outside, the first real warmth of the year was moving through the pine trees, and the city was making its ordinary sounds, and my phone on the table showed a message from my mother asking when I was coming for dinner, and everything was exactly as complex and as simple as it actually was. I had walked onto an aircraft 3 years ago learning to be furniture. I left that kitchen table known, fully, deliberately, irreversibly known, and that, in the end, was the only thing that had ever been worth arriving at.